Hey, I want to welcome everybody to our conversation on two leading scientists. Focus on some big questions today related to should Christians embrace or be open to evolution? What's a proper way or a thoughtful way Christians should engage the scientific community? To give some background, my name is Sean Mcdowell. I teach at Biola University in the apologetics program at Talbot. And about a dozen years ago, wrote a book with William Dembski called Understanding Intelligent Design. And since then, I've just been following and tracking this conversation because it's so important. It's changing fast before us. And as I work with Gen Zers, many young people today say this question at the intersection of science and faith is one of the most important ones that they just have questions about and really want some clarity. So if you have followed these conversations, you will definitely recognize our two guests. Let me start with Doug Axe, who teaches with me at Biola University. Doug has written a book not long ago called Undeniable. I'm going to hold it up there so you can see it. And teaches at Biola, does some work in biology, also does some work with us in the apologetics program as he can. Just finished a recent book. But anyone following these conversations will know that Doug has really become a leading proponent of the intelligent design position. Doug, thank you for coming on. Really good to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Josh Swaminas is also a friend of mine, and he has written a book that I'm going to hold up so you know, and this book is called The Genealogical Adam and Eve, a very fascinating novel approach. You gave me the opportunity to endorse this, and I gladly did because I think the spirit and the content is very novel and fresh, trying to show not that evolution is true, but that evolution is not a threat to the historical Adam and Eve. Very, very creative. We may get into some of that. Dr. Swaminas, along with Dr. Axe, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me again, Sean. It's great to see you. And you too, Doug. Thanks for coming along.
Yeah. This is great. I've been looking forward to it.
Well, as we get in towards probably the later part of the show, we're going to open up and take some questions from the audience if we have time. But first off, I have a few just kind of questions to frame your personal experience related being a scientist and your intersection on these questions. But first, those of you watching, if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button because we have a few interviews coming up you will not want to miss on the evidence for the soul. I'm going to be interviewing my father, who's been an apologist for 5 decades, about some untold stories and experiences and wisdom from a life being an apologist. That's coming up. You will not want to miss it. So, fellas, I'd love if we could start, and if you could just share briefly kind of your story as a scientist, intersecting with these questions and how it's led you to the position that you really hold today. Doug, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, I was interested in science before I was interested in Christianity. I became a Christian as a teenager and was an avid young scientist well before that. My dad worked for Dow Chemical Company back then, and I thought to be a chemist, to be in physical sciences, that was my dream. Became a Christian in my early high school years, and after that, started my undergraduate studies at UC Berkeley, and for the first time was dealing with worldview. I didn't have the term worldview, but I saw a clash between my new Christian view of reality and the view of reality that was being taught up front in some of my classes at UC Berkeley, and I became really interested in apologetics at that point, in particular in the idea that science might be done in such a way that it resolves some of the controversy or answers some of the questions that people are answering in different ways on different sides of these fences. And I got an opportunity to do that after studying engineering. I was not particularly interested in biology as an undergraduate, but I started to become more and more interested in the life sciences and approached them from the lens of engineering. So that really became what I felt like the Lord was calling me to do, was take an engineering approach and look at biology and examine the claims about Darwinian evolution and examine them from the perspective of an engineer turned biologist and see if I could find a way to shed light on those questions. So that's really what got me to what I've been doing for the last several decades.
Let me ask you one quick follow-up question. Was your coming to Christ, did it have anything to do with the science, or was it an experience, historical evidence? What was it quickly that led you to become a Christian?
No, it wasn't the science at all. And as I recall, I don't think I was a Darwinist. I think I rejected evolution as a non-believer. It was through the prayers of my mother, really, and the whole family came to faith, church-going family, and suddenly we started attending church, and we were all baptized on the same day several months later.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing your story. That's great. Josh, share your story with us, please.
Yeah, so I was born into a young earth creationist family, a family of Indian immigrants, and I was really searching for a confident faith, especially as I became drawn to science. Your dad's book was a key part of that stuff in junior high, reading about the one thing that just seems so not man-made in the Christian faith. I mean, if it wasn't for encountering the resurrection and who Jesus was, I would probably be an atheist right now.
Wow.
But, I was young earth creationist at the time, and I was drawn to scientific creationism. I didn't really find a confident faith there. I eventually got really connected to and drawn to the intelligent design movement. I was really convinced of a lot of their arguments. But I was also a science student, and as I learned more and more about biology and actually saw the evidence for myself, I just couldn't find confidence in intelligent design either. I mean, the science just didn't end up panning out in the way that I had hoped, and I really wanted it to. And in the end, I just was really stuck in this paradox of starting to see legitimacy to evolution, which we'll talk about what I mean, but let's just say common descent, and trying to see how that fit with this other source of truth that I really had confidence in through encountering Jesus. And that's really kind of where my journey really is, about recognizing legitimacy in evolution, even if I don't, or others aren't sure if they can swallow the whole thing. That's fine, but there's something legitimate there, and how to engage with that in a way that makes sense with a historic Christian faith.
That makes a ton of sense. Now, I have a follow-up for each one of you. Doug, you shared a story, and correct me if I get the details not right here, where when you came out critical of Darwinism in some of your studies, felt like you got nixed from a job pretty firmly. Do you mind sharing some of that story in context for us?
Sure. Well, I tell the story in my book of being removed from my position at the Medical Research Council Center in Cambridge. And I had been quietly doing my work there as an independent research scientist, putting together what I thought was the best way to test basically the information content of a single gene, trying to determine whether random mutation and natural selection would be able to invent a single new enzyme molecule, a protein. And I published some papers and was well along the way to getting a critical result when things got very political in the UK, and I knew that my position could be in jeopardy if the controversy boiled over there, and it did. And so I lost my position there in 2002.
That was 2002. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Now, Josh, you have, in your book, you talk about how for a while you were hesitant to come forward and share some of your views on evolution, but as you came out, your reception was a little bit different than Doug's. Would you mind sharing that briefly, if I got that right?
Well, I mean, I think, well, first of all, I mean, there's something to be talked about evolution. So most scientists reject Darwinism already. And frankly, if the question is Darwinism, we should all reject that. The church shouldn't accept something. There's no one advocating for Darwinism that I know of in science. I think that it's actually really lamentable, and I'm sorry that you. I mean, it's very likely, honestly, that you did lose that job for the reasons you state, Doug. I don't think it would be Darwinism, but because you were questioning the consensus on evolution, and I'm sorry about that. I had nothing to do with it, of course, and I don't know the details. For me, I've experienced a lot of rejection in other areas that were far closer to home in some ways. It wasn't my professional context all the time. But in my family context, as I became public about that, my family wasn't okay with it often. I mean, I still have relatives right now that have an issue with it. it was really striking and difficult to come public about it because of the rejection I faced in the church over this. And in the end, that was pretty difficult. And it wasn't without risk professionally. I just wrote a book about the de novo creation of Adam and Eve. There was an immense professional risk in writing that. And I did that before I had tenure as well. When I first became public about it being a Christian, it was like really public. It was in a Wall Street Journal article in, 2012. Once again, when I didn't have tenure. And, the thing that has just been consistently been the case, I certainly have colleagues that are what's the right word? I'd say the biggest way to describe it would be curious, but sometimes it's oppositional curiosity. It doesn't make sense to them where I'm coming from. But no one's come after me professionally. I've been really fortunate that way. And most people have actually been really curious and even thankful for the work I've been doing, even if they're not Christians. My experience in the church has been more mixed, where at times, even though I follow Jesus, people have even questioned that because of where I've come to, honestly. In more recent years, it's gotten better, but that's really been part of my journey, too, of experiencing a different sort of rejection.
That's helpful and interesting that both of you in different ways have paid a price for the position that you hold from different communities. I want to come to what we mean by Darwinism and evolution, but one more question first, if you could clarify more for us. Tell us kind of what you're working on right now, each of you, in this question of science and faith. Kind of what's your position and what are you working on right now in terms of the movement that you're a part of? So whether it's intelligent design or peaceful science. Doug, what is it that you're working on right now, and kind of maybe state just what your position would be?
Yeah, well, I made a move to Biola recently, so and evolutionary aspects of that. But really what brought me to Biola is a bigger program of, I feel as though we've spent now decades examining and testing a molecular mechanism. And I hope I get an opportunity to dialogue with Josh over that. But in finding that it doesn't work, I'm really interested in moving past that and gathering together scientists who don't accept an accidental account of life, who don't think that physics plus time equals life, and thinking about how we would go about doing biology from that perspective. So not worrying about making an argument, really, more concerned about developing new science and maybe asking questions that have never been asked before because they've been neglected because of the lens that everyone is viewing their science through a lens, and that's true of me, it's true of Josh, it's true of everyone. Some lenses are going to make you not see. I would say probably every lens is going to make some things not visible to you and other things visible. And our belief is that if the wrong lens has been pursued all this time, the materialistic lens, then there are things that biologists are not tackling well that could be tackled well. And that's really what brought me to Biola, is not just me doing my own work in a lab, although I'm continuing that, but rather gathering together chemists, biochemists, computational biologists, computer scientists, mathematicians, and doing something bigger.
That makes sense. I appreciate that. And you've told me that you feel the freedom to do that at Biola uniquely.
Right.
So we're glad you're there. Josh, tell us just quickly kind of what you're doing with peaceful science and what you're working on right now.
Yeah, so I found myself in the no man's land between the trenches in a debate that's been, pretty contentious for a very long time, and also stalled in some ways, and finding myself without really a clear camp. So that's kind of where I got almost forced into launching and founding Peaceful Science. But it's really kind of grown into something a lot bigger than that, and bigger than Origins. There's a lot more people getting involved, and we're really trying to engage across different worldviews, different ways of thinking about science, different ways about thinking about origins, and different theological perspectives and different scientific perspectives to engage a grand question about what it means to be human. And I've been really wanting to explore that in different ways. So one way is by looking at artificial intelligence and what that tells us about the soul and how it challenges that.
Okay.
More recently, related to biology, is we've been spending a lot of time, and I'm really, this is something that's pretty close to my heart, is really thinking through, to speak to Doug Axe's point about materialism not being enough, well, materialism doesn't give you a grounding for engaging questions that we're facing society now about race. And, are there different types of humans, and what's the right way to treat one another across differences? And so just looking at the science of race is something that I care about. It's connected to origins, but it's bigger than that. And it's a place where most people are a little bit fearful to go, because that's another big fight and debate. But I do think that science has something to say there, and I think that there's something that Christian theology has to say there too.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's jump into some of the differences, I think, here. And maybe we'll start with Josh this time. You said people don't embrace Darwinism, hasn't for a long time. Give us a definition of what you mean by evolution. And Doug, jump in here and let's see if we can at least find common ground on what we mean by it for starters.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the things that was actually a pretty key point as I got in my education. I just realized that the way how evolution is being presented in places like creation science, and ID isn't creation science, but also within ID, it wasn't actually what were becoming my colleagues in science actually really understood. One of those is I thought that evolution was Darwinism, but Darwinism isn't what evolution is. If you think about it like in the most reduced sense, what I'm really getting at, I'm not denying God's action in origins. I'm not insisting that we don't consider God in science or anything like that. I'm just saying that there seems to be a lot of evidence for common descent. It's evidence that even ID proponents like Michael Denton and Michael Behe agree exists and is there. And I'm even willing to say that if we take God into account, we don't have to say it's definitive and that it certainly was common descent, but it really looks like humans share common ancestors with the great apes.
So by evolution, you just mean common descent, mechanism aside. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I would also say that the focus, the first objection that will come from my friends in ID is they'll go to a claim that I didn't make about universal common descent. So for example, if we discovered life on other planets, that life, unless it was in Mars, probably didn't share common ancestry with us. Like universal common descent is not a fundamental belief in evolution. I think the key theological claim in evolution that's made it so difficult for 150 years, 160 years, has been the claim of the common descent of man. So it's about whether or not humans share common ancestry with chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. That's the key question for me.
Doug, jump in here. Are you okay with that definition? See it differently? Go for it.
Well, Josh knows this, that the term evolution is used in many different ways, and one of the ways is common ancestry. So Darwin's tree of life is one aspect of evolution. People use the term to mean change with time. People use the term to mean progress. It's become kind of a buzzword. It's used in advertising slogans now. The vacuum cleaner evolved, things like that. They also use it to refer to a mechanism. And so forget about creationists and forget about ID. Don't forget about them entirely. But if we take them off the table and you just look at AP biology text or go to a lecture at University of Washington, one of my daughters is majoring in biochemistry there, you'll get evolution that is very much the Darwinian. It's the modernized version. No one's still reading from Origin of Species, and they've added the new stuff. So it's the neo-Darwinian synthesis. It has its little nuances, but it's much the Darwinian package. So I'm not sure what Joshua means when he says that nobody is teaching that anymore. They certainly are. It's in the AP biology. Go get a textbook.
Well, I took AP bio, and I guess so if you look at the Descent from Darwinism, which I imagine you signed, it defines Darwinism as natural selection and random mutation being sufficient to explain the diversity of life. Is that what you'd mean by Darwinism? That's what the canonical definition of an idea is, as I understand it.
The dissent doesn't actually attempt to define Darwinism. It just says, I believe that this is an open question and needs to be investigated. And yes, I did sign that.
Yeah, but it does define it as natural selection and random mutation being sufficient to explain the diversity of life. I think that's almost a direct quote.
Yes, but it doesn't say this is a definition of Darwinism. It just says, I don't believe that science backs this up. It doesn't say this is Darwinism. But that's neither here nor there.
Okay. I guess it's implied. But I guess the issue though, this is what was puzzling to me as I actually learned about it, is actually most biologists would actually agree that natural selection, I mean, certainly most evolutionary scientists would agree that natural selection and random mutation is not sufficient to explain the diversity of life. I certainly think that, and that's not a controversial statement.
Yeah, so we'd have to get into further nuance. In Undeniable, I use the term accidental processes. So I think the key divide is this, and this is where I think Josh and I disagree, but if we don't, I think that'd be great. I think the key divide is this. It's not whether the tree is historical, although that's an important one. It's not whether change has occurred, because I think everyone agrees on that. I think the key divide, the most important...
I want to back up. So you actually have no problem with the idea of the common descent of man? You think that humans and...
No, I didn't say that. I said I don't think that is the primary, principal, most important point of division. Point where there are people on two sides, two camps.
Okay, so, but to be clear, you disagree on that. You just think that's the most important disagreement.
I do not believe in universal common descent. I don't believe that's the most important issue, right? So I can more happily embrace within the church people who accept universal common descent than I can people who embrace the idea that physics plus time equals life. The idea that accidental material processes are adequate to account for all of life, including us. That's the key divide, where the atheists all find themselves on this side, and I can't see how a Christian could find themselves with the atheist standing over there without compromising something very, very profound.
But I guess I'm not on that side.
Okay, so that's something that we need to unpack more. That's the point where if you disagree with that and are clear about that,
but that's like a shift. You're talking about produce life, because we're talking about are you talking about abiogenesis, which is like when the first cell? That's different than evolution. Like every scientist I know grants that evolution doesn't explain the origin of life. So why are you going there?
I didn't say anything about it.
Hey, let me jump in here. Here's what I think is going on, and then Josh, you can clarify. Is what Doug is saying is that he doesn't believe in universal common descent, but that's not where the heart of the debate is. The heart in his mind is the mechanism, and he doesn't believe there's any accidental mechanisms that can generate the complexity and diversity of life.
And I'm not just talking about the origin of life, I'm talking about the whole thing.
The entire package, so to speak.
Oh, you didn't mean life like the first cell. You meant like what we see.
I mean, your life. A butterfly is life. A tree is life. A mushroom is life. They're all alive.
Well, I mean,
I didn't mean to cut you off, Sean.
No, that's great.
I mean, I'm sure I'm going to cut you off too. I'm mainly just trying to understand, not step on your lines or anything. But I think I need to narrow it down, because I'm trying to think about this in a way that actually even scientific colleagues would agree. What I would say, I think the disagreement is that I don't think you're denying that physics and potentially, from a human point of view, random processes were involved in evolution. I think the key thing for you is whether or not science can actually show that there had to be a designer involved. Isn't that the core of the disagreement? That's not what it is?
That's the other side of the coin that I'm talking about. If it is true, if you affirm, well, let me just put it this way. Do you, Joshua, affirm that natural processes, given enough time, if there's an Earth-like planet out there, we would expect natural processes to produce complex life, possibly even intelligent complex, because that's what happens when there's an Earth-like planet. Physics does this in billions of years. Do you believe that?
I don't believe that.
Okay. That's a key dividing point, because all the materialist atheists do believe that. That is the teaching position.
I hang out with a lot of atheists, for better or for worse, and I don't know if it's that way. I think there's a lot of questions amongst atheists. I think actually the right answer is that science doesn't tell us that one.
So explain to me how an atheist would say, I don't think physical processes are adequate to produce life? How would they explain life on Earth?
So
if they
what
don't
you said is
think-
you gave like a counterfactual of like if we found another Earth-like planet, would we expect to see life that's intelligent as complex as we see here? I don't actually know if that's. I mean, some would say yes, some would say no.
No. I
Because
said
life could
maybe
be a total
even.
fluke,
I'm
right?
saying, well, it seems to me that if I put myself in the position of a materialist atheist, so there is no physics is all there is and all there ever has been. Okay, physics produced us here. If I'm an atheist wanting to hold that and be credible, I have to say, and it didn't require some obscene miracle. I'm not appealing to a spooky coincidence in order to explain life on Earth. Instead, as Dawkins says, as Darwin says, I now have an explanation for how that happened. I have a process that explains how chemistry and physics.
So what I would say is that there is a disagreement between me and atheists on this. But that's a different question, though, from what you said earlier about like an Earth-like planet and whether or not we would expect to see life there. But what?
I don't understand why that's different. I'm not saying that the probability is 1. I'm saying if you believe these processes they explain what happened here on Earth, then you must say in another Earth-like planet, there's a reasonable chance that they will produce something like that again.
So I think evolutionary science is a good provisional explanation for life on this planet. However, it is not a complete explanation and doesn't even intend to be a complete explanation. So in that sense, it's not a sufficient explanation. And that doesn't also mean it's also provisional, so there's going to be issues with it. Now, so that means that there's a part that it seems like we do know, and that's legitimately described in part by evolutionary science, and there's a part that we don't know. Now, the atheist is going to look at that mystery of the part that we don't know and say, well, it's just going to be more things that are just purely natural processes. And I'll look at that and say, yeah, well, maybe parts of that are natural processes, but you can't rule out that God was involved, and I have good reason to believe that God was involved. And so I'm really okay with that mystery being there and God being in that place of mystery, and that being actually a fairly large, gigantic piece of our history is mystery.
So what is the part that you think is explained, and what's the part that you think is explained?
Well, so for one example, I do think that there's a large number of patterns in the similarities and the differences between human and chimpanzee genomes, that there's a mathematical theory that's really easy to understand and follow through that explains why it is, for example, that the Y chromosome of chimpanzees is farther apart than the rest of the human genome. That's like a strange feature. That's something that actually, you want to have some sense out of it. It turns out that neutral evolution plus common descent gives us a mathematical way to untangle that. So that's an explanation that I get out of evolutionary science that I've just never seen a good quantitative explanation from another path. So that's a good explanation. Does that explain everything? Does that explain when humans get a soul? No. Does it explain what the image of God is? No. Does it tell us if Adam and Eve were de novo created? No. It leaves maybe the most important questions unanswered, but it is a piece of the data that it explains mathematically in a way that really no ID theory other than common descent has been able to do, or any creationist theory other than common descent has been able to really make sense of. So that's an example of something where it offers an explanation. It's not a total explanation, but I don't think science intends to do that.
And if I could jump in then, Doug, I want you to respond. This is a piece of evidence for common descent, not a naturalistic mechanism that explains how the process unfolds in an unguided fashion. Is that fair, Josh?
Well, it shows that there was, if you accept that account, it shows that a large number of mutations look like they're random, but it doesn't tell you that all of them are random. Like, that doesn't rule out the idea of God intervening and giving, critical coordinated mutations, or however you want to say it. That could have happened too. It doesn't rule that out. It just shows that a large number of the mutations seem to be neutral and seem to give that account. So it doesn't rule out God's intervention, as that's maybe how, actually that's a major objection I'd have to a lot of theistic evolutionists of how they've talked about it, and how a lot of atheists have talked about it, to argue what I just said rules out God's intervention. It doesn't. And in that part, I think ID has certainly had legitimacy, but it also doesn't, it doesn't rule in God's involvement either. I think it ends up being something that's indeterminate from the evidence. I mean, and that's not based on presuppositions. That's just like actually looking at the data as a biologist, and with a mathematical lens. I don't know how we would be able to detect it, given the data we have. Does that make some sense, Doug?
Yeah, I disagree, but I think I understand where you're coming from. And you put yourself do you describe yourself as a theistic evolutionist?
I don't really like that term.
Okay.
And I don't like evolutionary creation. And the reason why, it's about identity. Like, I'm a follower of Jesus first.
Right.
And what I say is I'm a Christian that affirms evolutionary science, or case, or science of evolution, right? So I think that's a better way to put it. I mean, I'm affirming that there's some legitimacy to evolutionary science, but I don't believe it's the whole story. I'm a Christian. I'm not an evolutionist. Like, my identity is in evolution.
Right.
Doug,
I mean, probably the same reasons why you wouldn't like it if I called you a creationist. I mean, you do believe in creation just as I do, but you wouldn't want to be called a creationist, I imagine, probably for similar reasons, right?
I mean, I'm content with that. Just as you wouldn't mind being called a scientist, that doesn't mean that you're not a Christian. It's just another. Although I don't like labels. I don't like labels, as they come to mean different things to different people, so they promote ambiguity in communication. So I just wasn't sure whether you associate with that term.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've also been a little bit outside. I don't know if you followed what's happened with me and many of the more visible evolutionary creationists, but
there was a Biologos. I've only vaguely heard there was kind of a parting of ways, or.
Well, it really came down to, honestly, a lot of these core issues. I think that, honestly, to be clear, and I might get in trouble for this, but I do think it's true. I think in several points, some of the arguments they made against you guys weren't really fair. And I'm glad to see that they've retracted some of them, but they really have a lot of work to do in terms of that. I think that we need to be doing a better job with people who are in the space together of really acknowledging the people across the aisle from us that are in the camp we disagree with when they get something right. And there's been several times, actually, where you guys have had things right and they had it wrong and they didn't actually acknowledge that. And one of those places is these issues we're talking about. I think that they've been too quick to dismiss the idea of God's action when there is no evidence against it. And they've claimed that there's evidence against it when there isn't.
Let me jump in for a second, and then I want to go down this road that you're taking us, Josh. Doug, you mentioned when Josh gave the example of why he kind of takes this evolutionary model, pointed to genetics, you say you differ. Not in terms of debate, but tell me why you see that evidence differently and how it may fit within an intelligent design framework.
Sure. So Josh is describing aspects of what's called the neutral theory of molecular evolution, which came out in the 1960s. Correct me if I'm saying anything wrong, but I'm trying to say that when you look at genomes, you see a lot of changes if you accept the tree. So you start by accepting the tree so that we can compare.
Well, that's not that part I disagree with. You
don't have to parts of the tree. It doesn't have to be the whole tree.
No, you don't have to accept the tree.
You have to make some comparison to say that this has mutated. So you're having to have some sort of lineage where you're comparing things that you take to have a common ancestor, and then you look at how their genomes differ or how their gene sequences differ.
What you do is you can start with a hypothesis that they share a particular common ancestry, or you can also consider a hypothesis where they don't, right? So you can do hypothesis testing in that framework. So that's different than saying you start with the assumption. You can start with different assumptions there. But go ahead.
I wasn't trying to critique that. So if I were doing it, I would start with the assumption that the things I'm looking at do share a common ancestor, and then you're comparing gene sequences. The claim of the neutral theory is that most of the mutations that become inherited, that become fixed within a species, don't do so because they had a selective benefit. They do so just because you have random things going on, most of which have a very small effect, or a lot of which have a very small effect, and they end up becoming just part of the history of that lineage. Not because they did something special, but they just sort of are markers of history. And
that's
so
right.
I agree that rose and became sort of a dominant theory, and they had to battle. Mutu Kimura and the others who put this forward really had to do battle to
with
displace the Darwinists. Yeah, and so that's now become standard theory. So I agree with Josh that there's aspects in which standard neo-Darwinian theory has had to give way to things that are just plain true, and this one is just plain true. But I come back to this.
Doug, I'm going to have you shift a little bit to your left. So there we go. Keep going.
The big question, the huge question, is the title of Darwin's book, On the Origin of Species. So the big question that origin scientists have been grappling with the whole time is, how do you account for the fact that we live on a planet that has all these wonderful things surrounding us? How do you account for that? And without doubt, neutral theory, for all the brilliance of it and the mathematical brilliance and the correctness of it, it doesn't explain any of that. It's just talking about the stuff that has no effect.
Actually, it's an interesting different lens, because I come from a theological point of view as a starting point. And from theology, it's been nearly unanimous that the origin of the species is not the difficult point. The difficult point is Adam and Eve, which is probably why I focused on that. And the thing about it's critical to understand about neutral theory is that if common descent is true and the math of neutral theory is approximately correct, doesn't have to be precisely correct, approximately correct, it would have been very easy for God to have created humans in a way that would have disproven common descent. It would have been very, very easy for him to have created Adam and Eve in a way that wouldn't have fit that model, because it makes very, very precise predictions on a very fine-grained level about what we expect to see in humans and chimpanzees. And when you look at that, it just fits perfectly in what you see with that. Now, you're right, Doug, that it doesn't explain all the functional differences between us and chimpanzees. Completely agree with you.
Which are massive.
I agree, it doesn't. But that's actually not the fundamental theological question, because the fundamental theological question has always been, do we really share common ancestry with the great apes? That's been like the sticking point for a very long time, and it looks that way. And that doesn't, and the reason why I think this matters is because even if it's true that God had to intervene, he could have done that in a process of common descent, and that would actually make it a version of evolution in a lot of ways. Even now, Mike Behe doesn't go out, claiming that label, and I don't want to put a label on him that he wouldn't like or whatever. But in many ways, in the same way, some people would still group me as a theistic evolutionist because I affirm common descent of man. The same would be said of true of Mike Behe. That isn't necessarily an idea that's in conflict with ID, right?
No. So Behe is certainly a proponent of intelligent design, and yet he holds to the common descent view. I'm not a proponent of common descent, but I hold to intelligent design. But you're talking about a theological, that there's something at stake theologically, that's origin of species is not the big deal theologically.
Theological point of view, I think that's almost indisputable. I mean, that's not just like Josh's point of view. I mean, if you look historically about what the fights were about, if you look at the Scopes trial, if you look at the response by the Princeton theologians like B.B. Warfield, if you look at more recently and why people have been concerned about evolutionary science, it's always been about Adam and Eve and human origins. The question about, the Cambrian explosion just does not have theological weight.
But I think the reason, yes, is focusing on human origins, but the reason there's been so much controversy there is because that's embedded in the question of, is God real or not? And the claim of Dawkins, a la Darwin, to have come up with an explanation where God's out of a job and we now can explain how life came to be without God. That's why.
Yeah, and I think Dawkins is wrong about that, for sure. So, look, I mean, I was drawn, ID was started in large part in response to the New Atheists. I mean, that's probably an overstatement, but it was in that cultural context of the 90s with, the Blind Watchmaker and responding to Dawkins. And Dawkins clearly overstated the case, in my view, of for atheism by proof of evolution, if you want to put it that way. That's a little bit of a caricature of his position, but I think you know what I mean. And I think that there really was a need to push back against that. I agree that evolution doesn't show that there isn't a God. And I think that evolution does not rule out God's involvement. both directly and miraculously, in addition to through natural processes. I mean, I think what we do know as Christians is that if evolution is true, God did it somehow, and he was part of the mechanism on some level or not, you know.
So I think where we differ is you say that the science does not rule out God. I say that science rules him in, that there is no other credible explanation.
Yeah, I think that's like the higher level. I think on the lower level, it comes down to specific ID arguments. So, I mean, I don't think we should get into the details right now. I think that would bore our poor listeners and certainly Sean. But and I don't mean this as like a dig. I mean, I really am up for dialogue with you about it. But you know, I looked at your scientific work on proteins, and there's just, as a scientist, trying to be as generous as possible about reading it. There's just like large gaps in the logic where I just can't agree with you on the scientific argument you're making. Now, what's tricky about it, and it's interesting, your book Undeniable, you argue that that we have an intuition for design. I agree with you. You argue that our intuition is correct and God really did design us. I actually agree with that too. And then you say, and now I just want to give you the science that shows you that intuition is correct. And that's the part where I end up diverging, because that science I end up having disagreement with. So that's, I think, the level at which the disagreement's at. It's not like a presuppositional sense of there's no science that could ever possibly do it. It's really just those arguments don't work for me.
Let me jump in. I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but I would like to at least surface some of the differences. So maybe, Doug, you could lay out kind of just simply straightforward some of your work on proteins and why you don't buy the mechanism, a naturalistic mechanism for the origin of life. And then, Josh, maybe just one core question or two where you don't buy it, and I'd love to hear how Doug responds.
Sure. So I'm not just talking about the origin of life. I'm talking about invention in life. So every time you see something new and clever and brilliant in living things, and that means you go look at any living organism, you're going to find scads of these things. Where did these come from? In all cases, they came from a designer having made them. They did not come from accidental processes just having come up with them, cobbled them together with no plan. So that's my claim. I don't make an argument in the book. I don't turn the intuition into an argument. I point out that the intuition is there. I'm not the first one to state so. And it's interesting that it's there. And so Alison Gopnik saying by elementary school age, children start to invoke an ultimate godlike designer to explain the complexity of the world around them, even children brought up as atheists. It's interesting that this is being admitted by some. They're not saying that these kids are right to attribute butterflies to a godlike designer, but they just do. And so it's interesting. It's not dependent on their parents having pushed them in that direction. I start with that in the book, and then I don't actually make the argument in my book hinge upon any technical molecular biology. By the time I'm starting to roll out, here's what you find if you look at enzymes, I've made an argument that doesn't require you to go in a lab and do molecular biology. It's an argument based on functional coherence. And I'm saying you can show there's a property of systems that show hierarchical complexity in order to perform a high-level function. It's always an extraordinarily improbable, by chance, organization that would do that. So in all cases, and I go through several examples where I'm not talking about biology, if you take a paragraph of text, if you take a digital photograph, if you take anything that performs a high-level function, it always requires an exceedingly improbable, I'm saying improbable if it happened by chance, arrangement of parts within parts. So you do that math and you show that you always have a fantastic improbability if you want to attribute these sorts of things to chance, which means you don't. You reject the fantastic improbability. You say, no, this couldn't have happened by chance. A monkey didn't type this paragraph on a typewriter. A human who knew how to use language did it instead. So that's the argument that's made, irrespective of any work on proteins. So I wouldn't have to bring any protein work in there. But then I say you do the work on proteins, you affirm that same principle, that the odds are fantastically against accidental causes having done these things. Therefore, they must have been done by someone who knew what he was doing.
Josh, jump in here, bud. What will be the key ways that you would just see it differently, or maybe offer a critique to this?
Well, I would just say that he's using, I would say, a strange model of evolutionary processes. We don't think, and like the mainstream account doesn't say it was by chance. So, I mean, it's great. I mean, I agree. Like all those things are very improbable by chance alone, but that's not what we think. So, I mean, that mathematical work, it just turns out to be modeling a straw man version of evolutionary science. So it just really weakens the argument.
I don't use chance. I say accidental causes. This is what I was trying to pin you down on.
Accidental causes, sure.
Okay. So are you saying biologists don't think, they think that evolution has to be directed in order to work? Is that what you're saying?
It depends what you mean by direction, right? So
we keep going back to the other Earth-like planet. I'm saying, do evolutionists, this is just true. I'm not going to ask you because it's true. The canonical view among evolutionary biologists is that physical processes are perfectly adequate to explain complex life, including us. Now, that's not saying that if you found another Earth-like planet,
but you're switching to something else. Like, so for example, most biologists would agree that natural selection does provide direction to evolution. That is providing direction, and that's not accidental either. So that's why I'm tripping up on the language, because
it is accidental. If no one intended for natural selection to work, then it's operating by, no one supervised it. Nobody.
Can I offer tell me if this clarification works. When you say accidental, Doug, you mean no top-down purposes and directions, so it's not sufficient bottom-up. But the way you're describing it, Josh, is natural selection offers a kind of direction on the bottom-up without top-down, not your personal view, but the way most scientists would look at it, because I think we're talking about direction and accidental causes in a different fashion.
That's true, except for natural selection is top-down too. But I think supervision, you're talking about supervision by an intelligent agent. That's what you mean.
I'm distinguishing purely natural processes from intelligent reaching in and arranging things. And when you look at life, when you look at anything that has high-level functional coherence, it only occurs if someone who knew what he or she was doing arranged things just so. Natural selection is not that. Natural selection is just a natural process, just like all the other natural processes. So I'm saying we can be confident that no natural processes, accidental processes, just physics, can arrange things to perform high-level functional coherence, high-level functions that require parts within parts. It can't happen, and we can show that it can't happen. That's what I'm claiming.
Yeah, like I said, so first of all, there was the issue with the math that's involved in those computations. I just, as a computational biologist, for my living, I apply math to biology. The models, the mathematical models to compute that, they just don't seem to be using a correct model of evolution. That's one. The two, the other piece of it too is that I think it's helpful to look at negative controls. One that I pointed out, I'm sure you've seen this, is looking at new functions arising in cancer. Cancer is actually a fairly complex disease that requires quite a bit of functional information. Some of our computations put it around over 1,000 bits of new information need to be injected into cancer for it to arise. And I think it's a good theological control, because I don't think any ID proponent is arguing that that God's like supervising in general. Maybe he's in occasionally, but I mean certainly not in general supervising the evolution of cancer. Yet we see that arise, and most people would agree it's predominantly by natural causes, and that's a lot of functional information. And I think that's one important place to look too, where I think that ends up just becoming one of those brute facts that's really easy to explain if life has the capacity to form new functions that are complex, and it's a little bit harder if you don't.
I would say, I think most people would say that cancer is not the if I'm asking where did birds come from, for you to say that cancer can happen in complex organisms does not seem like an adequate explanation. Cancer is an example of extremely complex organisms having something go wrong, And if you have a very high degree of complexity and something goes wrong, yeah, you can end up with a botched thing that still has complexity because it started with such high complexity. And cancer is replicating cells that are no longer controlled, so it's lost all the things that have to be working right in order for an organ and a tissue to perform a normal function in a healthy organism, and it's just proliferating. Okay, so it's just proliferating. It's just kept that one function, and it's untethered it from all the things that have to modify that function.
This is actually the part that I've found most interesting about a lot of these exchanges. So that would be an example of an argument that would make a ton of sense to me until I actually had like my medical training and worked in a cancer lab and just found out that description of cancer just ends up not actually being what we find. I mean, it was honestly surprising to me to learn this stuff. You actually have to work in these fields and actually work with those researchers, but it turns out the cancer is a lot more complex than that. And I also talked about functional information. Now, these are fairly low-level disagreements, and I don't want to get too caught up in this, but it's just, as a person who's predisposed to agree with you on so many things, Doug, I agree with you that God designed us all. I agree with you that natural processes are not sufficient to explain life on Earth. I agree with you that God either was or likely was involved directly in bringing everything about. It's just really these parts of the argument, I think they end up falling apart. Now, I think the question that comes from this is, why is that enough to take me outside the ID camp? And I think that's something that I probably have to explain on my side, but it also probably requires some explanation on your side too. I think within ID, the scientific provability of design has been really important. It's not enough to make space for design, you also have to show positive evidence for it. And I'd like to know more why that's the case, because I can make space for design, but I don't know if I can prove it. And then on my part, I guess the issue is, as a scientist and as a person in science, as a Christian, I think that one thing I've learned about science is that they don't actually have a problem with my belief in God or the resurrection. What they would have a very big problem with is me endorsing a scientific argument that I couldn't back up. And so there ends up to being a really big cost in arguing for. Now, it's different for you because you really believe that there's scientific legitimacy to your idea argument. So I'm not saying that's the case. I don't see that. And actually arguing something that I don't agree with or endorsing it in a way that they couldn't actually see too, that's pretty costly in science. And so the costs of endorsing something I don't agree with are pretty high, and I don't agree with it ultimately. And I just don't even see it as a core thing. But why for you is the positive evidence for science so critical?
Let me jump in and come back to this question. I just want to make sure for clarity that I got this. Doug, your big pushback is you don't think that natural mechanisms are sufficient, whether they explain cancer or not, to explain a bird and the complexity and diversity of life. Josh,
Correct.
You would point towards something like cancer, in details we won't get into, as at least being an example of how you can get kinds of information that are constructive, that would tell us how you could get birds through a natural process.
Well, I would not say. I've never argued for natural processes alone. I think that's a mistake to see science as arguing that. So I would agree, actually, with Doug Axe and many of my friends in ID that natural processes alone are not sufficient. So that's actually.
Did you say that you don't think scientists argue that natural processes are? So I'm wondering why you don't call yourself an intelligent design guy. Because if you don't think that,
because look, I think I talk about this all the time with my colleagues in science and my atheist colleagues, and they know where I stand on this.
Okay.
They also can see a difference between me and ID, because what I would say is that no, you can't. Science doesn't show you that natural processes are sufficient, because there are big lacunae, frankly, the majority of stuff we care about in science doesn't actually give us an answer for. And to say that and what it takes them a little bit of time to think through it, I'll grant you that, because that's not how they present it. But the fact of the matter is that evolutionary science doesn't give a total account of life, and it never intends to give a total account of life. And because of that, there's space to wonder, and I think I have good reason to believe that there's more than just natural processes there. Now, that's different than saying that I have scientific evidence to show that things that God had to be involved, but I think it affirms the fact that science does not give a total explanation of these things.
Josh, one of the things that at the heart of ID, as I understand it, is that you can actually recognize design scientifically speaking. It's not just a philosophical
Yeah.
inference. Would you say that you recognize design with an intuition, but it's not science to recognize design? Is that one of the hearts of the differences?
I wouldn't say it either. I think science considers design all the time. It has no problem with it. Like, we consider design all the time. I think the issue is there's a difference between divine design and creaturely design, and ID doesn't make that distinction. It says it's, as far as I understand it, those two are classed in the same category. But once again, I come at it from a theological point of view, and I think there's a distinction between the creator and the creatures, and the way how God designs things, the way how He designed salvation with His Son dying on a cross, is entirely different than how any creature that I know would design that. And so I think we have to make a distinction between that. That's a distinction that ID, as far as I know, isn't prepared to make. And then whenever design is considered in science, every place I've seen it, there's always a specific model of how the design is happening. And so you're never really ruling out design in total. You're ruling out a particular, or you're ruling in a particular model of design. Now, with some exceptions, I'll give you one exception, is Winston Ewert's work on this, on the dependency graph of life. But the vast majority of work in ID doesn't actually have a model for design or the designer. And that ends up to be a very large departure. And even if you read Dembski's work, he's clear that this is a departure from how scientists typically look at design. And I think that was an interesting idea. I just don't think it ends up working with the scientific method and how we think about things as science. I mean, when you think about design, you're always doing that in relation to a particular model of design.
Doug, I sense you want to jump in here.
The design inference, so Dembski's Cambridge University Press. There is a science of detecting intelligent action. SETI is the science of applying that science. So there is a general science. You don't have to have.
Yeah, but the idea departs from how SETI does it. So that's an important point. And also,
it's very much
himself backed off from from his book, The Design Inference. He's actually stated that he had it wrong in the explanatory filter. Are you aware of that?
He's not backed off from the basic.
Yeah, I can show you the quotes later. The key thing is he considers random processes alone. He considers natural processes. He considers randomness alone and isolation. But just as one example, he doesn't consider them together. And he's recognized. He's even stated. I'll give you the quote. Says that there was actually a gap in his argument. That's if he doesn't think explanatory filter is the right way to actually make the ID case.
Okay, so let me jump back. Dembski aside, we could bring him back on. Maybe he would be willing to join us at some point.
Oh, I'd love to.
You made an argument or not just a point, that SETI design detection is different than is done in ID. Clarify what you mean by that.
Well, can we take a more contemporary one, like coronavirus, where people were looking to see if it was designed in a lab or not?
Sure.
Do SETI.
Oh, we do SETI.
Let's start with SETI,
so,
and then we'll go to the coronavirus.
Yeah. So in all those cases, they're working with either usually an explicit, but sometimes an implicit model of what the designer is and what design is. So some people say it's not science because it's not actually ruling out hypotheses or whatever. That's not actually true. Like, so for example, SETI has essentially ruled out, or at least a scientific effort. This is probably done before them. That there's actually intelligent aliens right now on Mars, on the surface at least. I mean, maybe we'll find something in a lava tube somewhere. That's highly unlikely. So that's a specific, precisely stated case of a particular sort of intelligent aliens. There was the closest that I think they had to a positive detection would have been the whole wow signal, and immediately they were applying models to see what they'd explain it. And then more recently, there was the comet that came through. I forgot it's like a mommy or something. That's not precisely what it is. A particular comet that came through, or extraterrestrial object, or extrasolar object that went through the solar system. And immediately, the first thing they're doing is applying models about what that alien would be and would it do this and how would this work, and looking at probabilities on that. You can see the actual papers on this. That's how they do it. And an ID that doesn't do that. So that's the issue. They're not actually saying, in general, like I said, they give you some exceptions, like Winston Ewert's work. No, that this is the actual principle that's constraining what the designer would do and what he wouldn't do. And so does it actually fit that model or not? And that's just not how ID is done.
Well, you can flip that, and I think SETI has definitely not all along been simply an examination of Mars. It's looking out into the distant galaxy, seeing if there's. So you can flip that and say, you could approach this as saying, what would a designer do? But you can also flip it and say, what do pulsars do? What do natural things that are not intelligently, there's not an intelligent source, what sorts of things can they produce? And if I find something that's outside of that set, then I've got a case for there being intelligence. That's the broadest way for SETI to be applied, and that is the way SETI has been applied.
So
it's simply...
I would just dispute that. Like, so a great example of this is there was recently some work. There was an anomalous star they found that they were wondering if there was a Dyson sphere, or at least a Dyson swarm. Do you know what I mean by that? Like maybe there was an intelligent. I mean, this is something I've actually looked at really closely because I care about idea. I want to give you guys like a fair chance. But one idea that Freeman Dyson put forward is the idea that maybe like an advanced civilization would be trying to create tons of satellites harvesting solar energy around like a star, and that's what a really advanced civilization would do. And so there was they found a star that seemed to have a lot of clutter around it, far more than you'd expect by natural processes, and they put that forward as a possible example of a Dyson swarm around it. That part is following the exact logic of what you just said, except what happens next, and this is the key part. When they went that further, what they did then is they did real scrutiny to see, is this an anomalous, natural processes approach? Is there something that we missed here? And they did that. And in fact, every single case they've looked at it, they've had tons and tons of alarms, but there's never been a false alarm, because when they've gone back and looked at it, they've said, oh, actually, it turns out that this could also be produced by these other mechanisms too. We just didn't know that until this point. In that sense, it ends up really advancing knowledge. So there's a different process going on there than you're seeing with them, and they're working from a model, in that case, a Dyson swarm. So
that seems to be what I said. You're asking whether natural processes can produce the thing that was observed. If the answer to that, and you can spend a lot of time on that and go back and recalculate and rethink. But if the bottom line is no, then you've got a yes to, okay, this is not produced by natural causes.
So that's the part where I struggle with it, because I don't know of any bottom line, how we get to that bottom line. How do you know? I guess this is a real question I have. So I think there's definitely things, and maybe once again I'll get in trouble for this, I think there's definitely things out there that we can't explain right now as scientists by natural processes. Okay? I think that's the case. We don't have to enumerate them right now. Maybe we'll do it later, but I do think there's those things. But how do you determine, Doug, the difference between things that we can't explain by natural processes because there is no natural process, or because there's an unknown natural process?
Functional coherence is the thing I put forward. So I'm departing from SETI. In SETI, I take it you're looking for organized signals. So you're looking for signals that look like communication signals, and there may be a lot of assumptions that go into that, but I take it that SETI was embarked upon because people believed if there was intelligent life that was using electromagnetic radiation for signaling over long distance, you would be able to detect the difference between those signals, even if you don't know what they mean, and normal background noise. Signals don't look like noise. So even if you didn't know what the was, you could tell this is the sort of stuff that people who produce high-level functions put together, and it would be impossible to explain that otherwise. The general principle is what I call high-level functional coherence. If you see, so this is stronger than SETI, if you see a high-level function being performed that requires, and all of these do, every high-level function to be performed requires parts within parts, all arranged, pointing to the top level function. So you have components within components, elementary constituents, all arranged like the letters in a paragraph, like the parts in a smartphone, like the parts of any complex machine.
So I want to ask one key piece, because that might be a point of common ground, that what you're saying is stronger than SETI. Does that mean you think you're going beyond SETI in your methodology?
I'm saying the argument from functional coherence is more definitive than SETI, because SETI,
so there's a difference between how you're approaching it and SETI's approaching
it. They're similar in this respect. SETI is applying the question, can we explain this signal in terms of natural, ordinary causes? If the answer to that is no, then we say, yes, we found something. Okay, so that logic Forget about SETI. Don't get hung up on SETI.
I just don't know if that's how SETI works. But the part that I think that I agree with you on is you said that you're going beyond SETI's approach to do based on functional coherence, which is, I guess, my point, that you're taking a different approach. And I mean, that's okay.
There's an aspect
you're allowed to
that's
take
the
a different
same. There's an aspect that's beyond it. Okay, so if in the movie Contact, did you see Contact?
Oh, it's a great movie.
That's a SETI movie where not only do they find the anomalous signal, but they interpret it, okay? And they find the design to this thing that they go and build. That's the argument that I'm saying. It's not just that you can't explain the anomalous signals, it's that they actually put something together, okay? So that's the argument. That's the functional coherence argument from Contact. And you know, when you get that, it can't just be a natural cause, because natural causes cannot produce things like that. The odds against it are phenomenally.
So the signal they detect is an example of a. I mean, we should get to questions at some point too. But it's a good movie. It's actually a great place for. We should do a conversation
of Contact.
Contact, yeah. But it's interesting because they actually are working. So if you remember, there was a repeating sequence of primes. Mm-hmm. So they were working for. They were saying if we saw a repeating sequence of primes, we have some strong mathematical reasons to believe that there's no way that could be produced by natural causes. And in fact, that's something that'd be self-evident. So if there was a SETI out there that wanted to communicate with us, this would be a very natural way for them to want to communicate to us. So we're going to start looking for repeating patterns of primes. So that was actually a specific model of the communication that they looked for and found. So I mean, I think that is interesting. I mean, I actually think that ID would be. I really liked Winston Ewert's work. I mean, I think it does have some questions that he's raised that he has to work through still. And he came and actually dialogued with us a bit at Peaceful Science, which I really appreciate too. But his work actually was one of the few places where there was actually a model being proposed that we, as scientists, could actually sink our teeth into and actually look to see if that would actually really engage the data. So I really like that. I hope that ID spends some time doing more models like that.
Let me jump in for a minute, maybe get some clarity. We'll take a couple questions and we'll wrap it up. We didn't even get to the other questions we were going to explore about engaging the scientific community. We'll have to come back and do part 2 on this.
Well, I do have one question at some point, but we don't have to do it right this second.
Okay, let me ask you one for clarity, and then we'll come to yours, Josh. If I understand your positions, Doug, what you're saying is natural causes are insufficient, but you see evidence for design in nature which points towards some kind of mind. Josh, what you would say is you also say natural causes alone are sufficient, but you have insufficient. But you have theological reasons for believing God is a designer rather than scientific reasons.
Scientific warrant, also good scientific warrant that there's space for that.
Okay, so space.
So I think that the difference is Josh wants to say there's space for that, whereas I want to say something more than that. I want to say there's no way that you can deny it.
Yeah, I think that's I think I said. I think that Doug is saying that he has positive evidence for it or support for it. I'm saying I don't see scientific support, but I do see scientific space, and I have good enough theological reason, and that's enough for me. I think that's the difference, right, Doug? When you say that?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
So you would say yours is not God of the gaps, Doug, because there's positive evidence for design. Josh, you would say your view is not God of the gaps because science is not meant to fill those gaps in the first place.
Science is just so limited. It doesn't tell us nearly as much as we want. I think the people who think that it's ruled out God just don't understand science very well when they say that.
So somewhat we're up around here, which we didn't get to, is even the philosophy and the nature of what science is and what it's meant to accomplish. I think would be a helpful conversation to clarify.
Yeah, I mean, ironic. I actually think one thing that a lot of ID proponents, I think Doug Axe is one of them too, would say, I think that you guys have a view that science is a lot more effective and stronger than I do. I think it's far more limited than you do. I think that might actually be another place of core disagreement.
I'm not sure I would disagree with you on that.
Okay.
I see it as a very limited enterprise. Yeah.
Okay. Good. That is a whole other avenue I want to explore. But let's go ahead and ask your question, Josh, and then Doug, if you have something back, great. If not, We'll go to one or two questions, and we'll probably wrap up in a little bit here. I see there's some people all over debating the historical Jesus, saying hi. The comments are all over the map, which is great. People are diving in. But Josh, I know you had a question you want to get some clarity from Doug.
Yeah, so out of this book, but it's also undeniable. And I mean, this is a book I reviewed in Themelios, and I put this there too. And I'm not trying to spring this on you. Like for me, like I come at it primarily from a theological point of view, even though I'm a scientist. That's actually the biggest part of me. I mean, we have our disagreements about science, but sometimes I wonder actually if there's like deeper disagreements too, Doug. And there's this one part that you write, you've actually mentioned in more than one place, arguing for a confrontational approach to mainstream science, which I don't entirely understand. I don't think we need to take a confrontational approach to science. And then this is what you wrote. I wanted to know if you could explain to me where you get this from. It says that Jesus called his followers to surrender their lives, their pride, their earthly securities, and at times their possessions, right down to the shirts on their backs. He never, called them to surrender the truth. That they were charged with guarding, even if it cost them their lives. Sometimes the pillars are exactly the things that need to come down if the truth is to be heard and received. And the key point is, where did Jesus actually charge them with guarding the truth, even if it cost them their lives? Like, that's concerning to me, because I don't know of any point where Jesus said that.
Well, is the gospel truth?
Yeah, but
to guard the gospel?
I did with my life. And where did he say
that? He doesn't ask you to pick up your cross and follow him. He didn't say to Peter, when you were young, you used to dress yourself, but when you get older, you'll stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and take you where you don't want to go.
No, to be clear, a lot of people, I mean, our friend Sean Mcdowell wrote a book on Fate of the Apostles. Certainly, he was predicting that they would die. Certainly, he asked us to take up our cross and follow him. But he doesn't say to guard the truth. Like that's not. He didn't charge us with guarding the truth, even if it costs us our lives. That's just not what it says. I don't know any place where he said that. That's not like what you said. He said is not that. Like that's different. He didn't say, I'm going to charge you with guarding the truth, and because of that, you're going to die, and you should be doing that. He said, you will die. That's different than charging them with guarding the truth. I mean, the Christ I encountered in Scripture doesn't need my defense. He doesn't need to be guarded. He doesn't want my testimony.
Does the Great Commission, are we supposed to go into the world and preach the gospel? There's a connection between the church and truth. Sure, I'm not saying something controversial here, Josh, so I don't know how you're trying to turn this into
the context is you're talking about arguing against Darwinism / you're saying Darwinism, but let's just say evolution, and as you meant it. And you're saying that if a person holds to that God, well, Jesus did actually call him to surrender their lives and all of that. That I agree with. But he doesn't call us to not... I mean,
there's a context.
Just understand how you get that. I mean, it's like a theological point,
okay. So let me jump in and see if I understand, Josh. Your concern is if I understand you correctly, that Doug is saying we should just lay down our lives for truth in general, and you're saying no, we're only supposed to lay down our lives for the gospel. So where's he getting this idea that we should critique Darwinism in such a strong way? That's not an issue we should die on. Hopefully that.
Yeah, I hope none of us have to die for our faith, to be clear. And I hope that if we're faced with that we'll make the right choices. Who knows? Maybe we will do the wrong thing in that moment. But it's a very different thing to say we're going to die because we're willing to be truthful that we believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And to say that we should die because of an argument against Darwinism, that's a very big gap.
So let me jump in here then, Doug. I want your response. You're both agreeing that we should lay down our lives for the gospel. Scripture clearly says that. But you're concerned that Doug would have more of a model of confrontation because we should lay down our lives for truth in general, including Darwinism. And that's a model you don't think is scriptural, and you would argue leads to an unhealthy dialogue with the scientific community.
That's exactly.
Is that what you're saying? Okay. Doug, give us your thoughts.
Okay, let me clarify too. Context is everything. So I do not argue for a confrontational approach to science. Look through the chapter, see if you can quote me on that. I'm talking about it appears that God himself describes creation as though it confronts us. Romans 1, Job. Okay, so Romans 1, 20. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. That's the sort of confrontation I'm talking about. People who deny God are confronted by his reality. I'm not talking about me confronting anyone. I'm saying God is confronting us through what he has made, so that the deniers of God are shown to be foolish by what he has done. It's not a, would you please admit that God exists? It's in your face. You cannot explain this stuff apart from acknowledging God's existence. I'm not being in your face. God's being in our face. That's the context.
This has been a very helpful dialogue, Doug. I actually hope we can really continue this, because I feel like there's actually some understanding coming from this. Maybe I misunderstood you. I think this is a bit more sensible to me.
Okay.
To be clear, I wasn't trying to characterize you.
No, I got it. It's communication is hard, and it usually takes multiple rounds. The pillars, then, just to make sure,
frankly,
the pillars is to get the context right. I think I quoted. I don't have the book here, but I think I quoted William Lane Craig saying it's foolish to challenge one of the pillars of modern biology, and I'm responding to that, saying it could be.
So I guess the question though is that, like, and you're really arguing that challenge to Darwinism. So the way I would challenge that guy is I would tell him, well, modern scientists don't agree with Darwinism, so why in the world would you say Darwinism is an argument against God? One. Two, I would say, hey, even if evolution is entirely true, that doesn't rule out God's involvement. It's not a complete account. No scientist who knows half a thing about this thinks it's in a complete account. So why do you think it rules out God? That is being really direct, saying that this doesn't actually explain everything. But it isn't doing it by, I just don't see why I would need to challenge the mainstream account rather than just explain it more rightly.
I think it's because the mainstream account is, and we may disagree on this, I think it has become a worldview thing. So materialistic evolution has become the secular creation story. So it's not as modest as the way you're presenting it. It's not presented in modest terms. It claims to be the exponent. It's the blind watchmaker. Who needs God?
But I guess two positions from which to threaten it, and this is where I think it actually ends up undermining you immensely when you do it the way you're doing it, because this is something that we actually might agree on, Doug.
Yeah, hopefully.
I think we might. I think we both want to see people come to know Jesus. We both really want them to come to understand his role in the world and all of that. This is immense common ground, to be clear. And I'm honestly enjoying the fact that we've identified that. But the issue is that worldview idea, I think, is wrong. But that's not even what mainstream science is. And you can either do it as like a challenger to mainstream science, which puts you at a severe disadvantage, or you do it from within mainstream science, saying that's not even mainstream science. And that's just the stronger argument that doesn't, there's not even a debate to be had. It's more about just educating him. And I'd rather take that approach if the goal is really to get them to there.
So Josh, if I understand correctly, some of evolution, for a number of reasons, doesn't concern you because you don't see it being used as a part of this larger cosmological story to entirely describe the world in naturalistic terms. But Doug, you're saying it carries with it this worldview connotations that concerns you as a believer and in terms of how we should do science. Is that fair, Josh?
Yes, and I agree with Josh that if you go and talk to your average Joe or Jane evolutionary biologist, they're not necessarily having a beef at the worldview level. They're zeroed in on their topoisomerase or something. They're doing their work on this. They're not trying to be a worldview person, most of these people. What I'm saying is they're all working on these bricks in an edifice, and the way the whole edifice is being presented to Joe and Jane public is this is what shows that God is unnecessary. God is superfluous because we've explained everything without him. And I agree with Josh that that's baloney. And if you know the science, you know it's baloney. But this is the way it's being trotted out.
But I'm just saying is that even from within, consistent with mainstream science, that's baloney. And I think there's a far stronger case to be made by challenging that scientific worldview from within mainstream science than from outside of it. But the bigger issue, I would say, I mean, that is a key point of disagreement in terms of like the approach to it. But I'm going to have to think through, and I hope we can dialogue later, honestly, maybe just the two of us, because I really want to understand, because the part that does concern me is what it seems like you're saying that Jesus actually taught, which I don't know if he did. And if I could understand you better, that would actually put me much more at rest about where you're coming from. And it's maybe that I just didn't understand what you wrote.
Let's talk about a follow-up conversation in due time. I think there's a number of rabbit trails we could go down. I got one question for you, and then we'll wrap up. This comes from Pine Creek, and it was so up high I might have missed it. But he asks both of you, what would the world look like if it were not designed? Would it look any differently to you if it actually were an atheistic universe in which there's no mind behind it? Go ahead, Doug.
Go first.
Go ahead.
Well, I think, so suppose in the beginning were the atoms, suppose this was before Big Bang cosmology, people thought that the universe had been here forever. Suppose that were the case and this were a blind, indifferent universe with no God having created it. It was just nothing but space, time, and matter, energy. We wouldn't be here observing it, is the way I think things would be. But beyond that, I mean, and this is a contradiction, you'd have to observe it to see how brilliant even the space-time is and how brilliant the matter is, but there would be no one to recognize that. So I think it's incoherent. Brilliance in all aspects, not just biology. There's brilliance in physics, and none of it comes from nowhere. Okay,
very, very helpful. Go ahead, Josh.
I mean, I think some of these questions are really hard to deal with. Philosophers would say that they're too far from our state of affairs, and there's really not an easy way to answer those questions without burdening that answer with a ton of presuppositions. So I think it's really hard to answer that. I think that most atheists would have a hard time, answering a comparable question too. I just think that, what I can say is that we can ask, whether or not the world makes sense in light of atheism and whether or not it makes sense in light of Christianity. And I think that for me, the thing I come back to over and over again is the resurrection. I don't really know how to make sense of the resurrection in light of atheism. And I don't think science gives us it doesn't even intend to give us a complete account. It's not an argument for atheism or against God in any way. That most things are just blind. Science is just blind to. So, but the resurrection is that thing in history that rises. That's what really pushes me to see the world in a different way.
Josh, I do appreciate in your book on the genealogical Adam and Eve, at the end, even though this book was endorsed by Nathan Lentz and other scientists who are not believers, you included a section on the resurrection, kind of confessing your faith, which is an area all three of us have in common, regardless of some of these scientific details. So I endorsed your book, and it's a different topic than we looked at tonight. If those of you listening want to hear us unpack his book, it was actually Josh, myself, and Fuzz Rana from Reasons to Believe had a conversation a few weeks ago, and that was really helpful, just clarifying differences. So pick up his book, check out that conversation. Doug Axe, thank you for coming on. Obviously, love that you're at Biola, love being a colleague with you. Your book, Undeniable, I hope folks will also pick that up. And we look forward to your next book that comes out. We'll have you on to have a conversation and spread the word as well. For those of you watching, this channel is brought in partnership with Biola Apologetics. That's where I teach. Doug partners with us in this venue a number of ways. We have a master's in apologetics and also a master's in science and religion. And we would love for you, if you've ever thought about getting a master's, it's a distance program, coming and studying the questions we've covered in about an hour and 20 minutes over multiple classes. So think about joining us. There's a link in the description below. If you're like, I love this conversation, but not quite ready yet for a master's, we actually have a certificate program with some leading thinkers on issues like the resurrection, intelligent design, evolution, problem of evil, all these important apologetic issues. And there's a discount code below in the description that may be helpful for coming on the show. You actually save, I think, about $100. Last thing, if you are a first time to this channel, make sure you hit the subscribe button because we have some other interviews coming like this. I hope you found some clarity in this. This was super, super helpful to me. And Sunday night, have Hugh Ross coming on. He has a new book on climate change. And he argues that climate stability over 9,500 years is actually a kind of argument for design. I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. And then we have J.P. Moreland coming on, talking about evidence for the soul. And by the way, Josh, I saw your conversation with him, a part of it. It was fascinating. I hope people
with
will.
Who?
The conversation you had in Peaceful Science with J.P. Moreland and Nathan Lenz.
Yeah.
I just started to watch that. I'm going to watch it beforehand. But I hope people will check that out. That's up on YouTube. And then next Sunday night, I mentioned this at the beginning, but my father, somebody made a comment. They said, my dad, C.S. Lewis. I think that was a joke in the comment board. But my father, Josh Mcdowell, has been doing apologetics for half a century. And I recently sat down with him and he shared some stories with me that he hasn't shared publicly, at least in a long time. And I thought, my dad's in his 80s. I would love to get some wisdom and perspective from someone doing this a long time. And we're going to sit down together and just share some untold stories. And in many ways, my dad is kind of a modern day Paul. If I didn't know him personally and the people involved, some of these stories, I would be tempted to not believe them. But he has lived a radical, radical life. So bottom line, make sure you subscribe. We want to bring some quality apologetics material to you. So Doug and Axe, hang on, don't disappear yet. But to the rest of you, thanks again for joining. If you listen to this, please share it with somebody. We're trying to grow a channel that talks about truth, but just does in a respectful way to one another, even when we differ. So we will see you Sunday night.